What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. I'm Colin Newby of 97.5 The Fanatic and 93.3 WMMR, coming to you weekly with Philly Sports Talk. We're going to get into some Flyers because that was my most recent article published on 97.5thefanatic.com, but I wanted to get started today with Joel Embiid, and that's because I worked my first Sixers game down at the Wells Fargo Center on Friday night, so all excited to have this new experience, get into the arena, do some work leading up to tip-off, and about, 20, 30 minutes before the game starts, Matt Cord comes over the PA at the Wells Fargo Center, announces the inactive list. Joel Embiid was on it. It had actually been tweeted out by Shams, I think about 5 to 10 minutes earlier, but I hadn't gotten the word yet, and so Matt Cord sends that bad news into the arena. You heard little murmurs of boos from the Wells Fargo Center crowd, but not that many people were even there yet, what tells you a little bit about the excitement level of these early season games. And not that many people reacted, which also tells me this is kind of expected at this point, and this is just overall a weird situation. He missed Friday night's game after warming up, and it's with swelling in his knee. Also missed Sunday's game against the LA Clippers. Also going to miss Wednesday's game against the Houston Rockets. Why is that? Nick Nurse was asked about it after that game on Friday night when I was down at the Wells Fargo Center. Listen to what Nurse had to say.
Were you aware as the game went on about the situation with Joel in terms of Sunday?
I was not aware. I am aware now. Yeah, the Joel update is dealing with some swelling in his knee today, which is why it was questionable. Got to the arena, ruled out. We're going to treat it all weekend, so he'll be out for Sunday as well, and then hopefully Monday we'll be giving an update of where we're at, and hopefully we'll be in good shape.
Nick, does that mean there was some kind of evaluation here? Because when we talked to you at whatever it was, 5:15.
Yes, so again, he had some swelling from the last game. It's kind of something we knew we were going to be dealing with going into the season. You know, they do what they can do to remove that swelling, but it just didn't feel good enough to go. We're pretty well aware of that. I don't know, not too much longer after this press conference that he wasn't going to be able to go tonight, or the first press conference, I mean. And then they obviously looked at it again during the game or halftime or whatever and decided they need to treat it this weekend and go from there.
So just hearing Nick Nurse explain it after that win against the Nets on Friday night, and it was like the only fun game of the season, and that's what he had to talk about afterwards. Remember, this is the same guy who just, at one point before the season started, just refused to talk about the load management issue with Joel Embiid and Paul George. And at this point, with the way these things are being answered so uncertainly and just so mysteriously, just leads you to believe that this timeline is all dooming. Joel Embiid was warming up and he was dealing with knee swelling, and you're talking about knee pain management. That's their explanation for his absence, but that means he's going to miss Friday, Sunday, and Wednesday. He thought it was fine at 5 o'clock, 2 hours before the game was going to start, when Nick Nurse met with the media, and then it goes to he needs the next 5 days off. This is lingering for that long, and it's nagging him this big time. There's a problem with this knee. This is not to be taken lightly. Sam Amick has been doing some reporting for The Athletic, and he jumped on with Mike Missanelli on The Fanatic last week, and he's painting an even more dooming picture for the Sixers. It pushes you to thinking that long-term stability with the Sixers for Joel Embiid is just in question overall, and Sam gave anything but a positive outlook this season to compete for a championship, and I think at this point it's safe to say that this early season tailspin that they're in, the 3-13 start, after a few losses, you assume that the big name stars were going to come back and the issues would just kind of solve themselves at that point, and everyone would kind of forget about these early season games. They're past that. This is spun out of control. And it's really time to worry about where Joel Embiid's health is and maybe even where his head is at based on what the insiders are talking about. And Sam Amick was also saying to trace it all the way back to the Olympics. Nobody knows the logic that went into these decisions, either to let Joel Embiid play in the Olympics, not to manage his minutes, and how much the Sixers had to say in that, how much Joel Embiid was just doing it himself. But Embiid participated in everything for Team USA, and that's what Amick was telling Mike Missinelli. He goes from every practice, every shoot-around, every game with Team USA to now this weird timeline where warm-ups causes him to miss 5 days with knee swelling management. And he said the timeline doesn't add up. And it's just gotten downright ugly for the 3-13 Sixers. And think of what Joel Embiid has been surrounded by in the last couple of months. He's had the medical issues affecting his availability. Yes, and that's the big one. If your physical health isn't good enough, then you're not going to be on the court, so your status with the Sixers is irrelevant anyway. But there's also been the questions about his conditioning. There's been credible sources saying that, Charles Barkley and Shaquille O'Neal even, saying that his commitment hasn't been there all the way throughout his career to physical conditioning. You had the altercation with a media member and the subsequent suspension. Remember, that was the Philadelphia Inquirer columnist who we talked to Kevin Cooney about on last week's episode. You also had the leaked information from the private meeting that Tyrese Maxey shared about Embiid's habit to show up late for team activities. Maxey apparently brought it up in a safer environment in that team meeting, but it leaks out. And then Embiid's reaction to that was to say that, yeah, the rat has to go, basically. Not, oh, I need to show up on time. He's worried about who leaked the information. And then you've just had multiple other instances of controversial public comments. And at this point, it's just fair to think, where is his head at? What kind of public messaging is he even thinking about right now? He's not worried about getting back on the court. He's worried about shoving somebody from the Philadelphia Inquirer. He's worried about who's snitching on him for showing up late to team activities. Joel Embiid has a lot to clear up, and it's not just physical, it's mental too. It's possible that the all-around negativity, this huge web of doom that's being spun with the Sixers, has really just worn on him over time. And one quote from Sam Amick really stood out to me when he was on Mike Missinelli. He wrapped up his hit by saying, at this point, he's on track to being one of those tragic NBA characters that was never able to maximize his potential. Wow. He just said that about a star athlete in the city of Philadelphia, and this franchise, who's seen so many of them, most recently Ben Simmons and even Markelle Fultz. And just to think about the drama that has surrounded the Sixers over the past few years and how these things have just gotten to unthinkable limits, it's wild to think that Joel Embiid might be the next domino to fall in this situation of the chaos that surrounded this franchise. Got through our Sixers talk and none of it was positive. After the break, we're going to come back with some Flyers talk.
If it's happening in Philly sports, Colin Newby's talking about it. Go with him behind the scenes of legendary sports venues with the best athletes and the most iconic media personalities of the greatest sports city in the world.
What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. We're jumping into some Flyers talk. So tune out if you don't like the Flyers.
I hate hockey and I don't like kids.
On Monday on 97.5thefanatic.com, I addressed my biggest concern of the 24-25 season. Now, the Flyers entered this year not really expecting to make the playoffs, probably not even expecting to do what they did last year and stay on the playoff bubble until the 82nd game of the season. But that doesn't mean they entered the season with no expectations for what was going to happen, that they were just going to let everybody run out on the ice and not worry about the results. This rebuild is about a lot more than what happens on the ice in 24-25. I get that. The front office has to worry about freeing up salary cap restrictions, acquiring top-end talent, making sure this goaltending situation stabilizes after Carter Hart left the team, and restocking the prospects after losing Cutter Gauthier. So there's a ton of big picture issues that have to be solved off the ice. But in the meantime, I think one of the biggest issues that was being solved on the ice in 23-24 was the internal player development issue, and I credit John Tortorella for doing a great job with these guys towards the beginning years of their NHL careers and the steps that they've taken on the ice to become impactful NHL players who have a high ceiling and who have room to improve with these opportunities at the top end of the lineup for a rebuilding team that isn't necessarily worried about Stanley Cup contention if they fall a little bit short in those roles at the top of the lineup. I'm talking about players like Owen Tippett, Cam York, and Tyson Forster in particular. I thought all three of those guys had great seasons in 23-24. They were playing towards the top of the lineup, and they helped the Flyers stick in the playoff race till the very end. That inspired some optimism that some key future pieces were really taking shape, and the organization felt that way. Danny Briere said it very bluntly at exit interviews that some of those guys were taking strides and that was one of the best parts of last season. I actually asked Danny Briere about the very same thing at training camp, treated it as a given that the Flyers felt that way about Cam York and some other players that did make strides, but I asked about players who might take the same sort of jump in the 24-25 season. Take a listen to what Danny Briere told me the first day of training camp.
You guys are talking about development at the NHL level and seem pretty optimistic about certain guys like Cam York. Who were some of the players this year that you hope take those kind of steps that York did?
Well, I could say that for every player, but there's no doubt that Jamie Drysdale is a big one. Being healthy, we're excited to see him. Maybe a guy like Bobby Brink had an up and down season, but we didn't have him pegged in to make the team last year, and he showed up. He had a great training camp, provided some sparks here and there throughout the season, so maybe he can expand on that. But you could go down the list and want that from every single player. Another one for me would be Noah Cates. Had an excellent rookie season. Last year was a little tougher for him. I expect him to bounce back and have another season. But again, the exciting part is we're a young group, still developing, still trying to figure out how far we can push it. So that's exciting to me.
So let's think about the guys Danny Briere just named. Jamie Drysdale, Bobby Brink, and Noah Cates. They were a big focus of my latest article on 975thefanatic.com. Flyers showing underwhelming player development in 2024-25. And you can check that out on my social media pages or get the link in the show description. But let's start out with Jamie Drysdale. And this is a guy that Danny Briere called a projected top pair defenseman after the Flyers traded Cutter Gauthier for him last January. So this guy stepped in with big shoes to fill. He had some NHL experience with the Ducks, but I think the Flyers just overall didn't really feel confident in what he was doing out in Anaheim. Maybe that getting into the NHL too early maybe stunted his development. So they were hoping a fresh start would kickstart Jamie Drysdale. Didn't happen in the second half of last season. He missed a lot of time And entering this season, a lot of the optimism was spurred by him being healthy. Well, he's already out of the lineup, and before he had the injury, Drysdale did not look good at all. He had 1 goal and 2 assists in 15 games, but the real problem I think he encountered was his confidence on defense and the selective pinching. Now, the Flyers have Brad Shaw coaching their defensemen, and he's done a great job with a couple guys within the organization. Just look at Travis Sanheim. He's really blossomed this season, arguably into a number 1 defenseman, but also Cam York, Nick Seeler, Rasmus Ristolainen has improved since Shaw got here. But that's a big part of the optimism with Drysdale, too, that he can develop under Brad Shaw. But at least so far, and he's only played 39 games with the Flyers, at least as of the time he left the lineup with the injury, but he really hasn't shown that top-end ability that the Flyers hoped that they were getting. And now this limited amount of action, it doesn't mean that Drysdale can't ultimately come back into the lineup and hit that high ceiling that they hope he can reach, but if you're judging the Cutter Gauthier deal 1 year later, I mean, you're definitely not happy with the progress of Drysdale, either from an injury standpoint or just from an overall standpoint. So it's really not a good sign for the Flyers at all. Drysdale was supposed to be a key part of their future. That step in development has not happened yet this season. Take a look at Bobby Brink. I think he is undersized, and that's something that some NHL players can get around, but he's generously listed at 5'8", and he needs to bring offensive creativity and vision at that size if he's going to have a full-time roster spot, because he's not going to be a strong defensive player. He's not going to be winning too many board battles and playing a physical game to drive play at his size. That's just not his game. And he's created some opportunities this season, but I don't think he's worked his way into favor enough to be a top 6 scoring type, and I don't think he's carved out the best role for himself within the Flyers as an organization. So that's another guy that maybe the Flyers haven't seen take the necessary steps to inspire a lot for the future. Now let's go to the third guy that Briere mentioned in his comments, Noah Cates. And it's kind of been a while for Noah Cates also. He came up in 2022, the end of that year after Minnesota Duluth finished the Final Four run. He looked like he was ready immediately to play a bottom 6 role in the NHL and bring stability in that bottom 6, winning puck battles and driving play. He always had good, really the type of habits that make NHL coaches gush, just defensive responsibility, smart plays, and he looked like he was going to fit in right away. I think injuries and a lack of overall rhythm kept him from breaking out last season, but when he returned healthy, you heard Danny Briere say it, he was hoping for another jump in offensive production and just to regain the rhythm he had in his first full season in the NHL. That was 22-23 when he became really in some ways a shutdown center, and he even received minimal consideration for the Calder Trophy. But his ability this season to win puck battles hasn't even shown up, and that's been one of his career strengths. He grades really well by the advanced metrics traditionally. This year, he was absolutely awful to begin the season, and I'm going by the quarter mark here, which I just rounded off to 21 games. But through those 21, he was ranked 518th out of 520 skaters. That's with a qualified amount of ice time and expected goal share. Just over 34% on the expected goal share. And that's very concerning. 518 out of 520, and this is supposed to be one of his strengths. And the Flyers in that bottom tier of expected goal share with players like Eric Johnson, Drysdale is down there, Nick Seeler is down there. These guys are all towards the very bottom of the league in expected goal share, and that's one of the key metrics in hockey analytics, the expected goal share, but hasn't gone well for the Flyers this season. Even if you move past that group that Briere talked about and look at the guys that you kind of thought had already arrived last season, the indicators are just as bad. John Tortorella has talked about how Tyson Forster and Owen Tippett are two guys that can really drive the offense, and how the slow starts from both of them kind of stunted this offense. Owen Tippett was the big centerpiece of the Claude Giroux trade, and he made an impression in these opportunities the Flyers gave him in his first 2 full NHL seasons. He had 27 goals and 28 goals in back-to-back years, and in the middle of last season, the Flyers signed him to an 8-year contract extension. That's a huge vote of confidence for a 25-year-old to become a big part of the future. And he's been second on the team in goals 2 straight seasons, only behind Travis Konechny. Tippett only has 4 goals in, now it's 22 games this season, and that's a 16-goal pace over 82 after he had scored 27 2 years ago and 28 last season. And when you think about Owen Tippett, you think of him as a guy with great ability as a shooter. And now his shooting percentage went way up in that 27-goal season when he learned a little bit how to get his feet under him in the NHL. It went back down last year, but it's dropped even further this season, and he hasn't been great in his percentages of hitting the net. And I actually asked him about this in the locker room in early November. I don't think he loved the fact that I asked the question. He's a very mild-mannered guy, but he might have deep down been a little bit irritated that I said this. And he told me that the media looks into this way more than we should, and that he's been a shooter his whole career, just whenever he has a chance. Sometimes shots go in and sometimes they don't. Hey, that's just part of the game. And sometimes these things can even out over long sample sizes. Turns out this was right before the Flyers went on that 3-game road trip in early November. It was Carolina, Tampa, and then Florida. And that was probably his 3 best games of the year, at least consecutively. He was really driving play and doing what Tortorella's talked about in the past, being a power forward, being an aggressive guy who can make things happen out there. But after that 3-game stretch, when he returned home, he just kind of fell back into the same malaise, and he hasn't played with the same conviction. Owen Tippett is a guy who's very talented. He has all the raw tools, but he hasn't necessarily broken out and been a top line winger. He could play top 6 minutes for the Flyers, a team that's more than likely not going to make the playoffs, but I think he has a higher ceiling. I think he could be downright excellent if he continued the upward trajectory that he showed last year. So far, that hasn't really happened, but a lot of times it's like a volume shooter in basketball. If you just keep firing, eventually you're going to get a few more good breaks. So could that happen to Owen Tippett for the rest of the season? Yes, it could, but he's left a little bit of meat on the bone towards the beginning of the season in that first quarter. And I would say the same about Tyson Forster. He scored 20 goals last season, but one of the things that stood out, maybe even more than that, was the fact that he could drive offense from winning board battles especially, and just playing a puck possession game that helped the team overall. And that's why he didn't get scratched last year when he wasn't scoring. Tortorella decided to stick with him because he was bringing other things to the game throughout the season. But this year, Tortorella hasn't really been complimenting Forster for the same things, and I think the player agrees because he had talked about improving on those things after, I believe it was 15 games or so. November 18th is the date I have written down here, but he was emphasizing how he needed to show improvement in stick battles and just winning battles for loose pucks. However, I don't think he has been at the same level, at least throughout the whole season, and it's comparable to Owen Tippett, where could it improve the rest of the season? Yes, but I think it's fair to say you need to see a little bit more from Tyson Forster. By addressing the group last year, I feel obligated to do this, and by the way, I want to be measured about all of this because this article is very critical. Anybody who reads it on the Fanatic website is going to be able to tell that pretty soon, but especially in terms of that conversation I had with Owen Tippett, he is totally in the right to share that kind of thing, and this was not serious pushback that he gave me. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying too dramatically to think this was some sort of argument. It absolutely wasn't. But he's in the right to say that back and give the media an honest assessment of his game. Basically what I'm saying is if the media is willing to dish it out and be critical, they have to be able to take it. And if Owen Tippett wants to communicate that information back to me to try to consider, then I'm absolutely going to be taking it into my thought process. And that's exactly what I did after that interview in early November when I spoke to him over at Flyers Training Center. But another part of a measured analysis of this entire situation is that the guys I'm picking on from last year, Forster and Tippett, are the two healthy ones. There's two key injuries that don't really fall into this situation. Talking about Cam York and Sam Ersson. York only played 8 out of the 21 games that I chose as the sample size for that quarter of the season. He's approaching his 24th birthday now, and I think he's stepping into a role as one of the top pair defensemen. He's going to play with Sanheim as he returns to the lineup. They're going to be the top pair, but you haven't seen enough of him this season because he's been injured. That very much is a to-be-determined situation. And then you can really say the same about Sam Ersson. I think in his first couple games, statistically, he was actually terrible, but I think Ersson's made some nice saves. The thing you have to consider about him is workload. I mean, John Tortorella himself said it after the 23-24 season last year. He overworked Ersson down the line after Carter Hart left the team. He couldn't really handle that workload because the Flyers didn't have enough behind him. They kept at it, and the bottom sort of fell out by the end of the season. But I think Ersson, especially if he's in tandem like he was with Carter Hart in the first half of last year, I think he's got some high-end potential, but the lack of availability has kind of halted the optimism within the organization that they found their long-term solution between the pipes, because you can't determine that if the guy's not on the ice. And surprise, surprise, the front office has to evaluate goaltenders differently because of unforeseen circumstances. If you want to shift over to guys that probably weren't considered in that tier entering the season, and I could do an entire show on this alone because I published also in the Flyers Weekly Roundup a section about Morgan Frost and how he might get traded, so you can check that out also. But I think Frost's time in Philadelphia is ticking down. He hasn't had a good season either. He broke back into the lineup. Tortorella actually played him. That was the 22nd game of the season, got on the score sheet. But he's a pending RFA, and he's reached age 25 at this point, and he's still not a lineup regular. And with the swirling trade rumors, I just think there's too much here to ignore. I think if Morgan Frost was going to find his footing with the Flyers, I think it would have already happened. You never have gotten the sense that John Tortorella is the biggest fan of Frost, and at this point, I just think the ship has sailed. I expect Frost to be moved by the end of the season. One other guy that I can't get through this conversation without mentioning is Joel Farabee, and a lot of times I forget he's 24 years old. He's been in the league a little bit longer than most of the guys have been talking about. He'll turn 25 this season in February, but it's been 4 years now since he stormed out of the gates in that COVID shortened season. He had 8 goals and 9 assists in the first 18 games that year, and then that was kind of the point in time where things really fell apart for the Flyers. Because at that point, they were off to a hot start. They had that 1920 season behind them where they looked good, but they didn't do great in the bubble. But there was some optimism coming back. And all the situation surrounding Ron Hextall's draft picks at that point looked pretty good. Farabee was one of those guys that looked like he could become a core piece. You had Travis Konechny and Ivan Provorov seemingly stepping into top roles. Carter Hart was shaping up to be a starting goaltender at that point. But Farabee's downfall kind of coincides with the entire franchise. His play really slipped off after that hot start. The entire organization just kind of went into disarray for, 2 seasons there, because the next one was terrible. He came out of the gate strong in 23-24. That was last season, and that's when the Flyers had that first half that put them in the playoff chase, but he also faded in the second half just like the team did. And he's been okay this season. I think he's driven offensive chances a little bit recently, but he hasn't found the score sheet. And ultimately, this guy was supposed to be a top 6 winger. Now, he brings value the way he is. He's a tough player, brings a little bit of grit. Every indicator that I have suggests he's a leader for some of these younger players, the group that I'm talking about, who wants to develop into a Stanley Cup core, and that goes into the day-to-day of what the Flyers are trying to do, build a strong locker room during the rebuild. And yes, I'll drop the culture word. Maybe they think Joel Farabee's helping out the culture. So this guy is not just some bum who's taken up roster space, but he hasn't necessarily hit that ceiling that you thought he had a couple years ago when he first broke into the NHL as a full-time player. Going to take one more break and put all the negativity on hold, and in the final segment, I'll give you some reason to be happy with this Flyers team.
If it's happening in Philly sports, Colin Newby's talking about it. Go with him behind the scenes of legendary sports venues with the best athletes and the most iconic media personalities of the greatest sports city in the world.
What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. And I promise you some positivity to finish up the episode, and that's optimism about the rookies. I'm talking about player development here, and that happens at all levels of the game. It happens in the minors, the AHL, all these junior players that the Flyers draft, all these guys overseas that are going to come to the NHL eventually. But it especially happens with rookies. And everybody knows the big rookie that I'm going to talk about, Matvei Mishkov. Most Flyers fans don't even need any kind of sales pitch to believe in Mishkov, but this guy has been on fire. He played 19 games in the first quarter of the season out of the 21, and if anyone wants to take a guess why he missed 2, you can rewind to a past episode and see what I think about John Tortorella's decision to sit Mishkov as a healthy scratch. But I think this guy has lived up to the hype. He's justified the comparisons to Nikita Kucherov, at least in a small sample size. Had 16 points in his first 19 games, and I think he is the future of the franchise, the most impactful player in the fate of this rebuild. John Tortorella is going to try to continue to shape Mishkov we're going to see how that turns out. He still needs work in his all-around game, so he's very much a part of the conversation, and the Flyers have to hone him in and develop him as a player. But I think at this point in the season, you absolutely should be optimistic about Mishkov if you're a Flyers fan. And two other rookies, I think they've followed suit. You look at Alexei Kolosov. I'm going to put the off-ice concerns on hold here because I have not spoken to people that are in the know about this. I just don't know what's going to happen with Alexei Kolosov if the Flyers have Sam Ersson and Ivan Fedotov healthy. I think Kolosov is the number 3, which would get him sent back to the AHL, which I think is fair. But is he going to take off back for Belarus or Russia if that happens? We're not really sure in the general public. I know some insiders, Kevin Kurz of The Athletic is really the guy I'm thinking of. He believes that has a good chance of happening. But when Kolosov's on the ice, I think he's been a very good goaltender, a lot of athleticism, and I think there is reason to be optimistic about his development. Third rookie I wanted to mention, Emil Andre. This guy only played 4 games last season, and he was kind of a risk taker, a gunslinger, if you will. But that was a little bit too much in the risky sense. He ends up getting sent back to the Phantoms for the full season. But after the call-up this year, I think he's been great. He's been a puck mover who's not afraid to take those risks and be aggressive, but he hasn't necessarily gotten burned in like a reckless way. But I think his development is actually farther ahead than Jamie Drysdale's right now. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for the Flyers, I'm not really sure. It's probably a bad thing. I would lean that way. But while Mishkov and Kolosov entered the rookie seasons higher in the prospect rankings, I think Andre has actually changed the outlook on his future a lot more than those guys because he wasn't necessarily in the picture as much. Another quick note, just to be fair about this player development situation. When Danny Briere says that it applies to everybody, he's got a point there. And Travis Sanheim is 8 seasons into his NHL career. Travis Konechny's 9 seasons into his NHL career. Since Tortorella's come and really challenged these guys and tried to reshape their games, they've hit the peak of their production at this level. So there's a success story if you want to look at their player development on the overall arching scale. You can't just ignore Konechny and Sanheim, the 2 Travises. But if you look at the group, large sample size of players here, I think that's my biggest concern with the Flyers and with the rebuild in general. And also my top concern with the John Tortorella era. He signed a 4-year contract to coach the Flyers. This is his 3rd season, and I'm in serious doubts about whether he's coming back for that 4th one. And now that could mean a transition upstairs to the front office in some sort of senior advisor role. I could very much see that happening, but a big strength of his coaching style was supposed to be to challenge these young players and to have them develop in a tough environment with hard coaching. That's the goal with Matvei Mishkov, and that ultimately might be John Tortorella's long-term contribution to this franchise, is making Mishkov great in other ways. But right now, a quarter of the way into the 24-25 season, I don't think Tortorella's had the best year, and he better push some of these guys back on track, or else it's not going to spell that well for the action that's actually going on the ice and how it's going to impact this long-term rebuild on top of the things that Danny Briere and Keith Jones are tending to upstairs. But that's what remains to be seen with the 2024-25 Flyers. They're not a playoff team, at least not under drastic circumstances, and I'm sure you're going to hear that stat this week about teams that aren't in the playoffs that American Thanksgiving don't usually get in the playoffs. You'll also get the Black Friday matinee, which has become a good NHL tradition, and hopefully a fun rest of the season in general that gives you some talking points and some things to be excited about for a team that's not really going to contend for a championship. But that brings me to a programming update. I see that Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve are both Tuesdays. I'm going to have episodes out both weeks there, though. Might not be on Tuesdays like 97.5 The Fanatic Flyers Roundup. That day is to be determined this week with the holiday and with that Black Friday game. I'll probably get it in Wednesday night, actually. But at any rate, these things will come out, just maybe not on their typical days. So if there's readers, listeners out there that expect the schedule, you hang tight. I'll get you the best content that I can. Thanks for joining me, Philadelphia. This has been First Time, Long Time.